Welcome, friends, to the Generations broadcast. My name is Kevin Swanson. Dave Buhner also in studio with us as we continue to take a look at the culture around us and filter it through a biblical worldview and try to understand the influence of the culture and how it affects the minds of our young people, especially as generational trajectories are being set. Not by little programs that are broadcasting from my basement out here in the Eastern Plains of Colorado to 15,000 people, but there are massively centralized systems that are controlled, I think, by spiritual forces that really are setting our nation in a certain direction. Now, that happens in education, yes, but it also happens in the massive cultural machine that has been collected, that has been built over the last, say, 100 years or so, and is really pressing the nation in a certain direction. Yes, there are good teachers out there in the educational systems. There are good artists and musicians and movie producers and such that are producing little pieces here and there that sort of help to educate and to move certain small segments of the culture in one direction or another. But there is a massive river that is running towards the Niagara Falls that is being controlled by centralized forces that are far more powerful than you and I, and probably more powerful than any human being. Okay, my friends, these cultural systems are going to be defined by us on this program from time to time. We're going to get back to them. We're going to look at them. We're going to analyze them by way of a biblical worldview. And we're going to take a look at the influence of these cultural systems. Now, before I go there, here's sort of a random story I picked off the internet. Actually, I think my father did and sent it to me earlier this morning. And it happened in Portland, Oregon, where two boys, ages 11 and 7 years of age, had a loaded gun and tried to carjack and rob a woman in Southeast Portland on Saturday afternoon. After hearing reports of an 11-year-old with a gun, police rushed to Freedom Foursquare Church, and officers spotted an 11-year-old and a 7-year-old boy on the south side of the church. Police told this 11-year-old boy to keep his hands out of his pockets, but he ignored them. The officers grabbed his arms and found a cocked and loaded .22 caliber handgun in his pocket. Evidently, he was trying to carjack a woman's car in the parking lot. Amy Garrett, 22 years of age, was sitting in her truck when the two kids approached her in the church parking lot, tried to carjack the car. They told me they had a gun. I asked if it was real. They said you don't ever ask if a gun is real. There was a lot of curse words, and at first I thought they were just punk kids. So I didn't think they had a real gun until he showed me the bullets. Wow. 11 and 7 years of age, Dave. According to this, sadly, the police are not going to press charges. They just simply took the kid home with them. And even then, I don't think the kids were very repentant. So they didn't do very much to correct the problem. So, that's too bad. The civil magistrate is unable to deal with kids that are these young boys who are out of control. Now, Dave, at one point, it was the 14 and 15-year-olds or the 17 or 18-year-olds or the 20 and 21-year-olds. Think of Jesse James or Billy the Kid. Years ago, the bad guys were bad at 19, 20, 21 years of age. Then it was 15 and 16. Now it's 7 years old, 11 years old. These bad kids are getting badder, and they're getting badder earlier.
Well, they're in the advanced placement course.
Yeah.
Or criminal activities.
And it doesn't surprise me, Dave. It does not surprise me. I have a feeling we're going to continue to see a degradation of our young people, and it's going to happen at earlier ages all the time. There are, of course, our young girls. We're talking 7, 8, 10 years of age that want to look like prostitutes. And there have been a number of articles about that in some of the mainstream magazines recently on that, so it comes to my mind. But we're just looking at children being ruined at earlier ages. And Dave, it's not always by way of the schools, probably more by the peer groups, but no question about it, the media and the culture, the music plays a huge part here.
Right. But before we say that, we got to say in times past, there has been a force that opposes this kind of delinquency. And it's called dads.
Yeah.
If you had a 7-year-old boy and the police brought him home to your house, sirens are going, son, Dad, here's a son, and he was out, attempting to carjack, didn't carjack or anything, but he had a gun and he was threatening some people. My guess is that child would probably receive some consequences from dad.
He'd be grounded for 6 years.
Maybe a spanking.
Or that. Sure.
Maybe he'd go to his room without dinner.
Probably what's happened is he's had no spankings. Or if he's had, his dad was just a mean, angry brute that just beats on kids for fun. So you have a lot of problems in the modern family.
By the time you're 7, 11, you've had no correction.
In a world where 72% of these inner city kids are born without fathers, Dave, and where 41% of kids across America are born without fathers, they don't have fathers. And of course, Dave, statistics recently indicate that kids in these non-nuclear family homes are 10 to 20 times more likely to be sexually and physically abused. So, I don't know. What do you do with this dysfunctionality? Well, a little repentance would be good. But Dave, I do think, yeah, you're right. The family situation is important, as is the media. And those are the two issues that Phil Chalmers really narrowed in on in our interview with Phil Chalmers, who wrote the book Inside the Mind of a Teen Killer. He's visited with hundreds of these teen killers around America, and he sort of analyzed all this data. And Dave, granted, he didn't include certain things. He didn't talk too much about nature. I believe that nature and nurture are both issues. And so a young man takes responsibility, should take personal responsibility for the crimes that he committed. And I think that biblical law should be executed against these young people. It doesn't matter their age. Now, the Supreme Court of the United States and the Supreme Courts of these individual states have disagreed with me, unfortunately, and disagreed with biblical law. So we don't have young men and young women taking personal responsibility for their crimes. Nevertheless, even as nature plays a very important role, and we didn't emphasize that on previous program, and we had a listener who kind of chimed in a little bit and said you guys needed to, make sure that people understand that these people should take personal responsibility for their crimes. And I believe that, totally believe that. Nature is absolutely important. These young men that make these decisions do so because they have an evil heart and they have a depraved nature, and they're making these choices based upon their own evil heart and depraved nature. And yet, nurture plays a role as well. So we have to acknowledge, I think, both of these. And Dave, the kinds of nurture and the environmental conditions that are surrounding these young men are often just awful, awful, awful. I mean, you got young men that are raised in homes where parents have been divorced. I mean, that's awful. It's one of the worst things that could ever happen to a young child. And yet that happens a lot. It's shameful. It's horrible. It's one of the most disgusting things that we could ever talk about on this program. But unfortunately, divorce does happen. And these little boys are raised in homes that are non-nuclear, where the father is not even present. And it's a highly, highly dysfunctional situation. And friends, that's happening more and more and more as the years progress. So we're going to expect more of these 7, 11-year-olds doing crazy things. But there's another issue, and that is the mass culture. Dave, I have a feeling that these young boys, these 11-year-old boys, are probably tuning in with their iPods to some of the gangster rap and, the really, really, really popular stuff that talks about killing cops and everything else. You got music that is just, it's not music. It's just literally trash from the pit of hell that is affecting the minds of a lot of these boys. And there's one thing Phil Chalmers said in that interview, Dave. I'll get back to that. He said he didn't know of a situation in which they were not plugged into violent music, violent media, violent video games. He said he didn't know of a single one. Couldn't think of a single of all the hundreds of cases in which he's investigated. There wasn't a case in which the boys were not plugged in some way to violent media. And Dave, this may be one of the reasons why some of the random school shootings, et cetera, really took off in the 1970s. You had occasional murders back in the 1800s. By the time you get to the 1970s, now is when you begin to see, and you look at the end of his book, he's got a list of 300, 400, 500 cases of teen killings. And what you find, Dave, is there was about 10 of them prior to 1970. After 1970, he's got hundreds since 1970. Friends, something has been unleashed upon this world in the last 40 years that is just demonic to the core. And I think it's tied into the kind of music that these kids listen to. In just a moment, I'm going to talk about the major influences. I mean, the cultural influences that have turned the direction of entire social systems and civilizations. I'm talking about the centralization of power in culture, where I think the demonic forces have managed to develop a star system and cultural icons that have made tremendous influence in beating back the influence of the Christian church, in beating back the influence of Christian values, and destroying the family in hundreds of nations and most civilized nations around the world. We're talking about billions of people, billions and billions of people that have been influenced by just a handful of some of those powerful, what I call cultural giants or cultural Nephilim that have ever lived. We'll be back in just a moment to summarize these. Stay with me. My name is Kevin Swanson.
Every year, Generations with Vision sponsors a family economics conference somewhere in America. This year, we are sponsoring 2 conferences, one in Washington State and the other in St. Louis, Missouri. For families who want to reintegrate the family into a family economic vision. For families who want to find ways to mentor their sons and daughters into the family economy, this is just the conference for you. How do you choose the optimum business streams for your family? How do you integrate your children into the family economy? What about budgets and debt and capital investments? And what about inheritance and taking care of grandpa and grandma along the way? We'll have young entrepreneur panels, mom and daughter panels, farming panels, retail and e-commerce panels, audience surveys, and some great keynote speakers, including free-range farmer Joel Salatin, entrepreneur Eric Weir, and Kevin Swanson. Join us for our 4-day mega conference in St. Louis or the 2-day fall conference in Olympia, Washington. Register today at familyeconomics.com. That's familyeconomics.com. Register now and save. Early bird registration ends on December 31st.
Welcome back to the Generations broadcast. This is Kevin Swanson, always analyzing worldviews and how influential worldviews are in the way that people think and live. And those worldviews come about through different means. That is, many people learn their worldview by sitting in classrooms, and universities and K-12 schools are influential, and we address this from time to time on the program. And that's one reason why we advocate homeschooling our children by way of a Christian worldview. But friends, the cultural systems may be even more influential. And whether it be movies or music, they do have an influence on the way that people think and live. In fact, those iPods pretty much direct the way they're going to dress, the way that the culture is going to externalize the worldviews and then internalize them. And the externalization of the worldviews by way of the culture ties into internalization of the worldviews. And sometimes the externalization, that is when your children begin to take on the music and the dress and everything else, that eventually seeps into their being and changes their fundamental worldviews into existentialism, nihilism, Nietzscheism, Sartrean existentialism, or what have you. So they didn't just sit and read Sartre. They didn't just sit and read Nietzsche. It's boring to do that. Rather, they picked up on musicians that were influenced by Sartre and Nietzsche, and then they began to live out the worldview of Nietzsche and Sartre. So that's pretty much the way it goes as far as I've been able to analyze it. And by the way, my book, Apostate, is coming out in just about 2 to 3 months, where I am addressing not just the philosophical geniuses that made the world and broke the Western world, but also those cultural Nephilim, or those cultural leaders that have done immeasurable damage upon not just the United States and the United Kingdom, but also all around the world. Well, friends, it's the cultural heroes that ultimately, I think, set the minds and the lives of the masses. And that's why the apostasy that occurs with the Katy Perrys of the world and the Marilyn Mansons of the world really matter. And Dave, so many of the American leaders, the cultural leaders like the Katy Perrys, were raised in Christian homes by pastors in Santa Barbara, California. I mean, that according to what we've read about Katy Perry. And Katy Perry got sick of singing Amazing Grace, and she moved on into the pop machine, where she led millions of teeny bopping little girls to accept lesbianism through songs like I Kissed a Girl.
Well, Kevin, that sort of makes sense if you think about it, that the church is one of the few places where musical talent is still appreciated and featured.
Yeah.
A lot of these little Baptist churches across Texas and so forth, they're looking to put their children singing up on stage and give them the chance. And so they're going to develop their pipes. They're going to learn to sing.
Sure. And they develop some of the best singers. And Dave, I mean, it's amazing how many singers. Nat King Cole, one of the first songs he sung, Straighten Up and Fly Right. Didn't realize this till I heard it recently. Some announcer on the radio said that he wrote that song after listening to his father give a sermon on that particular topic. He wrote the song out of that. And of course, you had other singers, many singers who were raised as pastors' kids and eventually worked their way into the pop machine. And Lady Gaga was raised in a Catholic home. She attended Catholic schools, and now, of course, she promotes her homosexuality, sexual nihilism, and blasphemy better than almost anybody else. Madonna, same thing. Madonna was raised in a Catholic home, attended Catholic schools, and much of her stuff is, of course, the worst possible sexual decadence you can ever imagine, but she always combines it with some level of Christian blasphemy. She has the Immaculate Collection. She does the Like a Virgin, Kiss for the Very First Time. So she uses the same, sort of things that Lady Gaga did, and did it probably in a more radical sense than Lady Gaga is doing it today. But friends, here is a list of the best-selling music artists, and please do not underestimate the influence of these people. They're far, far more influenced than the average pastor who tries to bring something of a Christian message on a Sunday morning, or a youth pastor that tries to pull everybody together for popcorn and pizza. Meantime, the kids are listening to their iPods, and they're sitting around absorbing the cultural influences of the day, and they're going to be far, far, far more influenced by these cultural giants, these giants that are sucked up into the cultural machine that has incredible centralized power and the power to influence not just millions, but we're talking about billions of people around the globe. By the way, Dave, there's somebody who's just come out with a movie on the Beatles and the Beatles' influence. And as you take a look at the Beatles' influence, they are by far the most influential group in the history of the world, as far as I can tell, at least since Jesus Christ. Of course, they compared themselves to Jesus Christ. You remember John Lennon said we were more popular than Jesus, and yet the Beatles are slowly dying off. John Lennon is dead, and the Beatles' influence, I think, is going to wane. But at least for the time being, friends, in the apostasy of the modern age, where the Western world has been breaking down. You say, well, it was John Paul Sartre, it was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, it was Karl Marx, it was some of the atheists of the 1700s, 1800s that broke everything down. Well, they were the ones that informed the minds of the cultural Nephilim of the 2000s and the 1900s. But it was the cultural Nephilim of the 1900s that was able to take the ideas of the John Paul Sartres and the Friedrich Nietzsche's and mass produce it into the minds of the billions around the globe, at least the English-speaking billions. And that's why America and England have led the apostasy and have broken down the Christian faith in amazing ways. The Beatles did it by way of their music. And by the way, they are the number one most influential music producers in the history of music. They have distributed as many as 1 billion, maybe 2 billion albums. It's pretty hard to know exactly. Certified, I think they're up around 250 million, but the non-certified, if you include the non-certified albums, they're up around between 1 billion and 2 billion albums distributed. Dave, that's the influence of hundreds of millions of people, at least, in terms of developing their worldviews. And of course, it was not just the albums. The albums were shared, of course, shared with children and grandchildren. And so I think, Dave, the influence of the Beatles is probably the most significant. John Lennon being the most important songwriter of the Beatles, who wrote the song Imagine. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Obviously, excellent example of existentialism. And it was a very catchy tune and probably the most popular tune that John Lennon ever produced. According to Rolling Stone magazine, the number 3 most important song, most popular song of all time. Squidoo.com puts it at number 1, the number 1 most important song of all time. And he goes on, imagine no possessions. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. Yeah, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us and the world will live as one. The most popular song, according to some measurements,
most significant I don't
in
know
the history of music.
Right. Albums is one measure, and there's a more important measure, and that's the number of times people have heard a song.
Yeah.
You can have an album and not listen to it, or you may know every song on that album, heard it 100 times, because in the late 60s, as the Beatles were really on their rise, there wasn't 100 radio stations in the market. Mm-hmm. There were only a few, and the ones that played the pop music, the rock music of the day, the Beatles were featured, and they were featured a lot, and they've been featured now for 40 years. They're still playing it. And so whether you're hearing Yellow Submarine, part of their Acid Trip days, or you're hearing George Harrison's My Guitar Gently Weeps, or you're hearing Rocky Raccoon, or Why Don't We Go Do It in the Road? I mean, all these songs have been in the consciousness of Western society for 40 years.
That's what makes them so powerful, Dave. They come back. And they come back generation after generation, and they've sold as many as 1 billion, maybe 2 billion albums. Dave, this is incredible. John Lennon, attended Sunday school as a child, joined the Bible class, sang in the choir. He was confirmed at 15 years of age of his own volition, according to his biography. But he was such an Nephilim. He would influence so many people. He was quoted by Maurice Cleave in a magazine article in 1966. This is 1966, 5 years after they launched their first career, or for the first album. And he's quoted as saying this: Christianity will go, it will vanish and shrink. I couldn't argue about that. I'm right. I'll be proved right. We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was all right, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me. So that's what he said originally. And at the end of his life, he had a press conference in which he said he believed in the God in all of us, which amounts to, of course, Emersonian transcendentalism or Eastern pantheism. And that's pretty much where he wound up at the end of his life. But the point is that these guys had the influence to break down the Christian faith in the hearts and minds of hundreds of millions, if not billions of people around the globe.
And it's an interesting progression. And when you study the Beatles, they came over to America. They had the page boy haircuts. They were singing "I Want to Hold Your Hand," little, happy-go-lucky, easily chorded music about young love. But it quickly turned into the drug culture, and the Beatles became the long-haired hippies that we see on the cover of Let It Be or on the White Album. And before long, they're singing about drug trips. They're singing "Happiness is a Warm Gun," which is about heroin. They're talking the whole Peter Max era of Yellow Submarine and "Picture Yourself on a Boat on a River with Tangerine Trees and Marmalade Skies." They are really into the whole acid trip, the Eastern mysticism. And because they are so popular and because they've already got an established audience, they really give the 60s drug culture a big push into the greater culture.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, friends. After the Beatles came who? Well, after the Beatles comes Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson is the number 3 most important artist. He sold between 350 million and 750 million albums in his career that ran from 1964 to 2009. So it was a long-running career, but he took over in the 1980s as the quote-unquote king of pop. Now, his most popular album was the Thriller album that came out, I think, in 1986, if I'm not mistaken, sold more albums, more copies than any other album in the history of popular music. He sold 65 million albums of that one album, Thriller. The album celebrates the thrill of evil. If you read the lyrics of these albums, you're going to find that he celebrates the thrill of evil. That's what he calls it, exercised in sexuality. He talks about ethical ambiguity as well. Throughout the song, he talks about no mere mortal can resist the evil of the thriller. And he also repeats the lyric, "It doesn't matter who's right or wrong," about 15 times, bringing back the concept of Nietzsche, who wrote a book on that. Beyond Good and Evil. So the idea that, one can't be right or one can't be wrong, the confusion of right and wrong, bad and good is something that Michael Jackson made a centerpiece in his career. In fact, he had an album called The Bad Album. You remember, Dave? I always wondered who would buy a bad album, but the confusion of the ideas of bad and good and evil is something that those who have celebrated ethical relativism have been doing since Friedrich Nietzsche. Okay, so after the Beatles, we have the 4th most popular musician of all time, and that is Madonna Louise Ciccone. She was raised in a devout Christian family, or Catholic family, as I said, and was sent to the Roman Catholic schools in the Detroit area. So that brings up Detroit as well. Throughout her career, she promoted premarital sex, homosexuality, sadomasochism, feminist sexual domination. Her albums, concerts, and music videos are filled with innuendos that mock Christian themes, as everybody knows. And she, I think, was also the most edgy musician. It's interesting that the most edgy musicians eventually, Dave, in the 1990s turned over to women. I think that's interesting. They tended to be the most edgy, at least in the high pop scene. Madonna has sold between 270 million and 300 million albums, according to this Wikipedia list of the highest, most influential musicians ever in the history of music. And Dave, she led the sexual decadence of the 1990s. There was nobody who was that far out on the edge. In fact, I think it was 2004 or 2005, she came back onto the scene and celebrated lesbianism with, I think it was Britney Spears as well. And Britney Spears, of course, was another rising star in the decadent female star scene. And she also was raised by a devout Christian mother. And helped to pave the way for hundreds of millions of others to move towards apostasy, cultural decadence, and social disintegration. So
it was a long way from Elvis being considered a
little edgy,
because he moved his hips on stage, to Madonna, who just seemed like
she would strip down to nothing. on stage.
I believe she did an album or a book just called Sex, and
she did.
She was
Her
always
book was called Sex and was filled with a bunch of pornographic pictures of herself and others.
Yeah, she was always pushing the aberrant sex.
Yeah.
She was not celebrating marital love ever. She wasn't, of course, the first musician to celebrate sex or to make it a big deal, but she really pushed it in your face.
You need to understand, my friends, these are the most popular musicians of all time, all right? They sold hundreds of millions, if not billions of albums and influenced billions of people around the globe. Somebody had to lead the apostasy. Somebody had to take the hands of hundreds of millions of people and lead them out of the Christian faith, out of the Christian churches. And it was the musical, cultural Nephilim, the giants, the evil giants that were able to capture the attention of hundreds of millions of people that accomplished this incredible feat. This is one of the most amazing stories, I think, in the history of civilizations ever since the worldwide flood. This is amazing what these modern day Nephilim have accomplished. And the fifth most popular musician of all time, of course, is the Brit Elton John, who was a known homosexual. And by the way, the seventh was Queen, which was led by another homosexual. So now you have homosexuals that are leading the culture as well.
Queen, like in Drag Queen.
That's right. In the 1970s, Dave, it was a little edgy to come out as a homosexual. And he did, I think it was about 1975 or 1977, if I'm not mistaken. He called himself the guy goes both ways. I can't remember, bisexual first. And then he finally admitted in 1977 to be the homosexual. And that was edgy, but it was musicians that were doing it. And Dave, it was important that it was musicians because musicians have a way of working towards the heart of the people that listen to the music. I mean, they're very talented people. And music can bore to the heart. And once you've borne something to the heart and you've taken a music form to the heart, now it's no big deal for people to accept you as a person and to accept your particular perspective of homosexuality as well. That's why Elton John was so important. He was an early pioneer in homosexuality. He was an early pioneer in music, and he was an early pioneer in leading the masses towards a pro-homosexual culture, and that's where we are today.
And it should be pointed out that he has now been knighted, so he is Sir Elton John.
Yeah.
I don't know what order of knights that is, the order of queer knights or something, but he was knighted by the Queen. And your point is well made, that music tends to lubricate the message.
Yeah.
It tends to make it lubricate so it can slide into the heart, almost unbeknownst to you. In fact, music has been used in programming the mind many, many times. I just saw a little article here. Christmas music makes shoppers spend more.
Yeah.
That's why they play it in the malls, right, because it programs you people.
Extremely influential.
So you're listening to All I Want for Christmas, and you open up your wallet and you start spending more money in the shopping mall. That's what music can do. And when you listen to it, and we live in a world where you're surrounded by music. You listen to music in the car, you hear music in the mall, you hear music in the office oftentimes. Music is everywhere. You got it on your iPod. It's everywhere, Kevin. You're just being saturated in these messages.
These, my friends, are the fastest selling, best selling music artists of all time. The Beatles, Michael Jackson, Madonna, Elton John, and finally, Led Zeppelin comes in at number 6 as the most popular album sellers of all time. Led Zeppelin, one of the very, very first heavy metal rock bands, came out of England. And they actually had a tremendous appreciation for a man by the name of Aleister Crowley. Aleister Crowley was a famous Satanist. And Jimmy Page of the Led Zeppelin band called Aleister Crowley one of the misunderstood geniuses of the 20th century. Aleister Crowley was raised by Plymouth Brethren parents. His father was a pastor in the Plymouth Brethren denomination. He quickly apostatized in his college years and became the early promoter of decadent sexuality, recreational drug use, witchcraft, and all of that. In his writings, Crowley refers to himself as the beast and opposes Jesus Christ in the most blasphemous terms. Okay, that's Aleister Crowley. And so you have Led Zeppelin, who was able to sort of take some of these ideas of Aleister Crowley and move them into the mainstream. The band's most popular song, Stairway to Heaven, they make reference to Crowley's poem, May Queen. And Led Zeppelin 3, it's an album called Led Zeppelin 3, a very strong-selling album. The band placed the phrase, do what thou wilt, in the lacquer of the album itself. Do that what thou wilt was the famous moniker of Aleister Crowley and, of course, well reflects the autonomy of John Paul Sartre.
Sounds like what Jesus said to Judas.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yep, do what thou wilt. Do whatever you will. And Dave, I think you get a little blasphemy in there as well. You sort of get the autonomy of John Paul Sartre and a combination of the blasphemy where he's approving of the work that is accomplished by Judas, who betrayed Christ. Well, Dave, I mean, these are the examples. I mean, we have so many other examples, I'm sure, of bands that have been influential, but these are the 6 most important. I did not include Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley is a little bit of an anomaly of sorts, but he certainly led the sexual decadence in some respect of the 1960s and 1970s as well.
I think you needed Elvis in order to have the Beatles. You don't get the Beatles without Elvis.
Yeah, he certainly paved the way for them.
And you need the Beatles in order to get Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Robert Plant
right.
and company don't make it to the shores unless the Beatles had been here first.
And the Rolling Stones.
The Rolling Stones, yeah. and so many of the other
They're
English
all tied
bands
in with each other, but I think it's important for us to treat the top 6 because they are somewhat the forerunners. They're certainly the ones that others look up to. People who tend to be at the top of the charts are those that, others down at the lower levels of the pyramid are going to look up to. And so it's important, I think, when we are analyzing culture to take a look at the Nephilim, the cultural Nephilim, the giants, the evil giants that have accomplished so much in incorporating the Nietzschean worldview, the Sartrean worldview, the Marxist worldview into the warp and the woof of modern culture. These guys have been so much more popular and so much more powerful, Dave, than parents and pastors for the most part. I mean, there's obviously exceptions where people homeschool,
right,
and where they block out these cultural influences. But wherever kids are going to public schools and private schools and they're sharing media, they're going to pick up on these artists and the artists that they influenced in the 80s and 90s and on into the present generation.
And what they're doing is they're going right along with the mainstream of the zeitgeist of the day, which was rebellion against parents. You see what happened, and you can trace it through these artists, is offending the right folks. Being offensive is all right if you offend the right folks. If you offend the right folks, especially your old folks, your parents and dead white people and fathers of community, if you did that, that was cool. Even to this day, that's considered a virtue if you're offensive to the right group of people. If you're offensive to Christians, that'll make you very popular in New York and in Hollywood and in Nashville too a little bit.
I know, Dave, there are a lot of Christians that like these artists, but make no mistake about it. We should at least be honest. These people were self-consciously apostates from the Christian faith. They were self-consciously atheists. They were self-consciously Satanists or self-consciously New Ager, Emersonian, Eastern mystics. This is what they were self-consciously turning away from godliness. I'm thinking Madonna. They're self-consciously sexually decadent. They're self-consciously Nietzschean. Michael Jackson. They're self-consciously atheistic. Imagine there's no God. Imagine there's no heaven. There's no hell below. Imagine all the people redistributing the wealth. They're self-consciously Marxist. At least acknowledge that these are the cultural leaders. These are the people that have performed the numbers that are on your albums, and you're getting to like the music. You're getting to like the people. Why? Because you like the music. And at least as Christians acknowledge that they're apostates. They have turned away from the Christian faith. You can say that for the Beatles. You can say that for Michael Jackson. You can say he turned into Jehovah's Witness thing for a little bit and then eventually died a Muslim. He was a self-conscious apostate from the Christian faith. Elton John, a self-conscious apostate from the Christian faith. Led Zeppelin, self-conscious apostates. On into witchcraft, on into New Agey Emersonian transcendentalism. This is the worldview that characterizes the people that rule the culture of the day. They're at the very, very top of the pyramid. They've sold billions of albums. They have influenced billions of people, not just in America, but every other nation around the world. When I was in Japan in the 1970s, it was my friends and my friends' older brothers that were listening to this kind of music. And they were being influenced in the 1970s in Japan, in every little nook and cranny throughout most of the developed nations around the world. Their worldviews, their culture has been set by these cultural Nephilim, who, for the most part, are apostates from the Christian faith. Friends, my book Apostate is coming out in just about 3 months. Get ready. I'm going to survey what happened to the Western world, who made the Western world in the last 200 to 300 years, but really broke it down in the process. They took control and then they broke it down and busted up civilizations, social systems, cultural systems. They have moved us to Gomorrah, and it started way back in the 1500s and 1600s, but made its way and consummated in the cultural music that's been produced over the last 100 years or so. Well, folks, you can interact with my radio program by emailing me directly at host@kevinswanson.com. You can also call into the program if you have comments that you'd like to have included on this radio broadcast. Our call-in number is 877-520-9510. That's 877-520-9510 if you'd like to call in and provide some input to the program. This is Kevin Swanson, and I'd like to invite you back again next time as we continue to lay down a vision for the next generation.